I'm going to read you a little something. Fairy tales are that simple. All you need is a rusty nail and something that is hidden away and spellbound. And beautiful can be transformed, disenchanted, and reanimated. In real life, no one hands us a nail that can lift away our cares. I have a very exciting book that I'm going to share with you. So you've probably heard of Hans Christian Andersen. He is a fairy tale writer and collector. I tend to associate him with the sad fairy tales because he wrote things like The Ugly Duckling, The Little Mermaid, and in his version, she dies. Spoiler alert. I guess that came a little too late, but in the Disney version, I know that she doesn't die. She gets married and lives happily ever after. In Hans Christian Andersen version, she does not do that. So he was around the 1830s that he did his writing and collecting of fairy tales. And then you've probably heard of the Brothers Grimm. They were in the early 1800s to about the late 1850s, somewhere in there kind of thing. So when a lot of people talk to me about fairy tales and they're talking the later fairy tales or what they consider the darker and the later fairy tales, they're talking about the Brothers Grimm often because they'll say, oh, I've read the Brothers Grimm. Now, the Brothers Grimm are actually considered one of the first modern, sort of the fathers of the modern fairy tale. Because there was way before that, even before Hans Christian Andersen, there was Charles Perrault, who was writing in the mid-1600s. So there's a lot of crossover as well. But I don't want to talk about these guys. These are the four or the three sort of big ones. There's other ones, lots of other ones out there. But some very exciting stuff, and I'm really happy that I got this book. I'm most of the way through it, but there's a lot of reading to do. So there's new fairy tales, let's put it that way. So in 2009, in Regensburg, Germany, in a municipal government archive storing place, there was a woman, Erika Enchensier, not sure if I'm saying her last name right, so forgive me. She discovered about 30 dusty boxes and opened them up and found the writings of Franz Xavier von Schoenwert. Hope I'm saying that right. And he was a writer around the 1850s, I believe. Yeah, around the 1850s. He was gathering and collecting and writing fairy tales, much in the same manner as the Brothers Grimm. And he wrote all his tales. He was coming from Bavaria, so he was born there, and that's where a lot of these tales come from. And they were not discovered until 2009, and there's over 500 new fairy tales, basically. And then the person Erika, we'll just call her Erika because her last name's really hard to say. When Erika discovered those, she worked tirelessly to compile and translate and transcribe and edit the fairy tales, because I'm going to talk a little bit about how he collected them and whatnot. So in 2012, the book was published. Of course, it was in German, and it was not translated until 2015 by a woman named Maria Tatar. She was the one that translated it to English and brought us this book, The Turnip Princess. The Turnip Princess has the new fairy tales, all 500 of them. So far from what I've been reading, there's some very new ones. There's some that are, sound a lot like some of the other ones. They're like, again, they're crossover because a lot of fairy tales travel, and it depends on, the culture you're in as to what version it is. Just like, Little Red Riding Hood has many, many different versions around the world. But the Brothers Grimm actually knew of this guy. But this guy, when he first published his books, They didn't sell, they didn't take off. He was a government official, so he had a steady job, a steady income, and he even talks about, they were talking about some of the quotes that they have from him, and he talks about how he felt like people didn't really take his work seriously on collecting these folk tales and these fairy tales and things like that. And, you know, why would a government official want to be doing this? And some people were even suspicious of what his sort of angle was, that sort of thing. So sometimes they wouldn't even tell him the stories that they knew. But he managed to get quite a few. Obviously, he wrote 500 of them. So what the Jacob Grimm said about von Schontworth, or Franz, as we'll call him, is, no one in Germany has gathered tales so thoughtfully and thoroughly with such finesse. This observation about Schontworth made in 1858 by Jacob Grimm. So like I said, there were 30 boxes that were just sitting in this municipal office for over a century, not even discovered, and suddenly are discovered in 2009 and were published in 2012 and not translated to English till 2015. So this book has only been around for 5 years for English readers. And I'll read a couple quotes out of it because it's such an exciting book. So long before Disney, folk tales were seen as lacking the kind of substance that might make them worthy of scholarly attention. They had already begun the great migration to childhood. So that was another barrier that Franz was coming up against, is that a lot of people were sort of dismissing fairy tales and storytelling as a child's thing. So they didn't, when he asked them for their stories, they felt it's just nonsense, you know, it's just a nonsense story. And one thing I found about this, because it is translated, and when Erica got a hold of them and transcribed them, she transcribed them in a way that she like didn't massage them at all. And some of them are really rough. And I don't mean just rough as in like, oh my gosh, you know, that's a terrible thing. But even the language, it's like, you know, there's no flourish to it, or there's not a lot of flourish to it. Yeah, so I say Franz gives us a harsher dose of reality. Cinderella is a woodcutter's daughter that uses golden slippers to recover her beloved from beyond the moon and the sun. So he does have a Cinderella version in here. His miller's daughter wields an axe and uses it to disenchant a prince by whacking off the tail of a gigantic black cat. The stories remain untouched by literary sensibilities. So that's what I mean. They're very plainly spoken, because he's getting it from, you know, a lot of people that are very plainly spoken anyways. And there's a lot of, you know, we're used to fairy tales that sort of star the princess, right? But they talk about here, where is it now? Yeah, so, but Franz's stories show us that once upon a time, Cinderfellas evidently suffered right along with Cinderellas. He's got boys that are going through the same kind of persecution and having to overcome their terrible conditions to win out, kind of thing. So he's kind of got an equal balance there of boys and girls going through things. Not one to dress up a tale with literary flourishes, and this is true. When I first started reading it, I was like, wow, this is very plainly spoken. But they talk about another thing too, because you'll find this if you do decide to read this book. So not one to make dress up a tale with literary flourishes, or to make it more child-friendly. He does not. Franz keeps the raw energy of the tales, resisting the temptation to motivate surreal plot twists or to smooth out inconsistencies, because there are some. These tales move at warp speed out of the castle and into the woods, generating multiple encounters with ogres, dragons, witches, and other villains, leaving almost no room for details explaining the how or why things happened. The driving question is always, and then? And that's one thing I did find about these tales. Again, like I said, they're very plainly spoken. They move quickly. You're suddenly in bed in a castle or having breakfast in a castle, and then you're out fighting an ogre in the woods. And there are a few inconsistencies, but they're a lot of fun. And like I said, some of them you might sort of recognize there's elements of Cinderella or there's elements of Sleeping Beauty, and there might be elements where it's affecting a female lead, it might be affecting a male lead. So there's a lot of out of the box kind of fairy tales, and it's kind of exciting because none of these you've ever read before. They're all brand new, new to us kind of thing, even though they're from the 1850s when they were first written. But again, like I said, only discovered in this century. And what was the other thing I was going to say? Like I said, they're very plainly spoken. There are inconsistencies. They move quickly. But you'll recognize some of them, and I've had a lot of fun reading them just because they are so brand new to us, and it's interesting because, like I said, there's boys and girls that are being affected in the same way that you may have seen other princesses affected. Oh, and that was what I was going to say, so I got back around to it. And even Franz himself, unlike, Charles Perrault, who massaged or always had a moral at the end of his tale. If you read his true fairy tales, there's always a moral at the end. And the Grimms, their 1812 version of their fairy tales is probably the clearest or the most true version, because when they published in 1815 again, and that's the edition that most of us have read, is the 1815 version. The 1812 version, as far as I know, has not been translated. Perhaps it has now, but it wasn't at first. So a lot of the fairy tales that we knew from Grimm's was the 1815 version, and that was massaged a little. They had a lot of fairy tales too, and a lot of them got dropped in the 1815 version. And then there may have been some new ones added and whatnot, but they were definitely more massaged. They're, a lot of people say, oh, those are dark fairy tales. And yes, they are, but there were darker versions in the 1812 publishing, but that was in German only. It wasn't translated to English. So a lot of us English readers we think of the 1815 version of that. But these are brand new, so look for it. The Turnip Princess. I'll try and put a link in the, well, I will put a link in the comments below or the description below, so that if you want to get it, you can. I got this right off of Amazon. And like I said, it's 500 new fairy tales that you may recognize a few things, like there's a Cinderella version and there's a Sleeping Beauty version, but it's his country's version. Like I said, he collected from Bavaria and that sort of surrounding area. So that's where you get slightly different versions. And again, his are unmassaged. He tried to stay very true to it when he wrote it. He wrote it right down as the person was saying it. So they're a little more plainly spoken. There's not a lot of flowery transitions or anything. Like I said, it's suddenly you're in a castle, you're in a house, you're in the woods, there you go. So but it is a good read, and like I said, it's new fairy tales. So I would read through it just to see what's kid friendly. Some of it's a little bit dark, so you might want to just peruse it before you start reading it to your children. But if you want to enjoy it, like I said, you can order it right off Amazon. The Turnip Princess, very exciting. 500 new fairy tales from the 1800s that you have not heard of. So I hope you enjoyed this review. I really enjoyed that book. I'll be back again with another book that I'm just finishing up. Okay, take care. Bye.